A homeless girl, soaked from the storm, begs an old man for shelter. He wants to turn her away, until he sees something familiar in her eyes. Letting her in, he notices a gold locket around her neck, and his heart stops. He knows that necklace. He's given it before. When he asks where she got it, her answer shatters his world. Who is she? And what long-buried secret is about to be uncovered? Stay with us, because what happens next will change everything. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. David stood frozen in the doorway, his weathered hand gripping the door frame so tightly his knuckles whitened. The wind howled behind the girl, whipping her soaked hair around her pale face like dark seaweed. Lightning flashed, illuminating her fragile frame as she hugged herself tightly, shivering violently in her drenched clothes that clung to her like a second skin. His mind screamed at him to shut the door, to return to his carefully constructed solitude. He didn't need complications. He didn't need anyone. But something about her desperate state made his chest tighten uncomfortably, stirring memories he'd rather keep buried. She looked so small, so vulnerable, like a half-drowned sparrow. Her lips had taken on a bluish tinge, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably, the sound barely audible over the storm. Another gust of wind drove sheets of rain against her back, making her stumble forward slightly, her shoulders hunching against the assault. David let out a heavy sigh that seemed to come from deep within his bones, carrying the weight of years of isolation. "One night," he said gruffly, stepping aside. "That's it." The girl practically fell through the doorway, her wet sneakers squeaking against his hardwood floor, leaving muddy streaks in their wake. Water dripped steadily from her clothes, forming a puddle where she stood, spreading like a dark stain on the worn wood. Without a word, David walked to the hall closet and pulled out a thick towel, tossing it to her from a safe distance, maintaining the barrier he'd built around himself. She caught it clumsily, immediately wrapping it around her shoulders like a protective cocoon. David watched her carefully as she dried her arms, noting how thin they were, how her clothes hung loose on her frame, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. "This way," he muttered, leading her toward the fireplace where embers still glowed from earlier, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She followed him silently, her footsteps leaving wet marks on the floor like a trail of tears. David added another log to the fire, watching it catch and crackle to life, sending sparks up the chimney. The girl hovered uncertainly near the hearth, clutching the towel like a shield against the world. She opened her mouth several times as if to speak, but no words came out, only soft, shallow breaths. David didn't encourage her. He didn't want to know her name or her story. She'd be gone tomorrow, and that would be the end of it. Just another brief interruption in his solitary existence. He walked to the kitchen, his joints protesting the movement with familiar aches. There was still some soup left from dinner, a simple vegetable broth with chunks of potato and carrot floating like islands. He heated it in the microwave and carried it back to where she stood, steam rising from the bowl like morning mist. "Eat," he said, placing the bowl on the coffee table. She stared at it for a moment before practically lunging for it, picking up the spoon with trembling fingers. David watched as she wolfed down the soup, barely pausing to breathe. She ate like someone who hadn't seen a proper meal in days, each spoonful disappearing with desperate urgency. As she ate, David couldn't shake an unsettling feeling that crept over him like morning frost. Something about her face, the way she held herself. It tugged at his memory like an old splinter working its way to the surface. Her dark eyes, the slight furrow between her brows as she concentrated on the soup, it all seemed hauntingly familiar, like a photograph he'd seen long ago. She finished the soup quickly, setting the empty bowl down with slightly steadier hands. The color had returned to her cheeks, though she still shivered occasionally, like autumn leaves in a gentle breeze. David studied her profile in the firelight, trying to place that nagging sense of recognition that wouldn't leave him alone. Who was she? And why did looking at her make his chest feel tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name, didn't want to name? He pushed the thoughts away, firmly. It didn't matter. She was just another stray blown in by the storm like fallen leaves. Tomorrow she'd be gone and his quiet life would return to normal, undisturbed and predictable. She's just another lost soul, he told himself silently as he watched her from his armchair, the leather creaking softly beneath him. Nothing more. But deep inside, something about her continued to unsettle him, like a word stuck on the tip of his tongue, refusing to be either remembered or forgotten, a persistent echo of something he'd lost long ago. The storm continued its relentless assault on the old house, rain drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Inside, the fireplace cast dancing shadows across the worn floorboards, its warmth a stark contrast to the tempest outside. The wind howled through the eaves, making the ancient structure creak and groan in protest. Emma sat curled up in the ancient armchair nearest to the flames, her previously soaked clothes now mostly dry. She had wrapped herself in the thick wool blanket David had grudgingly provided, making herself as small as possible in the large chair, as if trying to disappear into its weathered fabric. David sat in his own chair across the room, pretending to read but watching her over the top of his book. Every few seconds, his eyes would drift from the unread pages to study the girl's face. She hadn't said more than a handful of words since he'd let her in. Just thank you when he'd given her the soup, and yes when he'd asked if she was warm enough. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, broken only by the occasional pop from the fireplace and the steady drumbeat of rain. Finally, David closed his book with a soft thump. "You got family somewhere?" The question came out gruffer than he'd intended, making Emma flinch slightly, her shoulders tensing beneath the blanket. She hesitated, her fingers nervously playing with something at her throat. After a long moment, she shook her head, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames, refusing to meet his gaze. David exhaled heavily, running a hand through his gray hair. The gesture betrayed his growing unease. The last thing he needed was some runaway with no place to go. He had enough troubles of his own without taking on someone else's. But as he watched her, something caught his eye, a glint of gold in the firelight, a brief flash that made his breath catch. His heart stuttered in his chest and time seemed to slow to a crawl. There, hanging from a delicate chain around her neck, was a small golden locket. Not just any locket. This one had a distinctive pattern of tiny roses etched into its surface, with a small nick on the bottom right corner where it had once been dropped. The familiar design sent a jolt of recognition through him, awakening memories he'd spent years trying to forget. David leaned forward in his chair, his book forgotten in his lap. His eyes narrowed as he studied the piece of jewelry, willing himself to be wrong. But he knew that locket as surely as he knew his own name. He'd chosen it himself, spent an entire month's wages on it 30 years ago, carefully selecting it from dozens of others in the jewelry store window. It was Lily's locket, his daughter's locket, the one he'd given her on her 16th birthday, just 2 years before their falling out. The one she'd been wearing the last time he'd seen her, when she'd stormed out of his house, tears streaming down her face, vowing never to return. His breathing became ragged and his hands began to tremble. Questions crashed through his mind like the thunder outside, each one more urgent than the last. How did this girl have Lily's locket? Why was she wearing it? What did it mean? The possibilities made his head spin, but deep in his gut he already knew. The familiar curve of her jaw, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, just like Lily used to do. This girl wasn't just some stranger who'd shown up on his doorstep in the middle of a storm. The truth was staring him in the face, written in every feature. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him dizzy and disoriented. He stared at Emma, really seeing her for the first time, and wondered how he could have missed it before. The truth was there in every line of her face, in the way she held herself, in those eyes that were so achingly familiar. Even the slight tilt of her chin when she was nervous. It was pure Lily. His hands shook as he gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white with tension. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. But the evidence was right there in front of him, wearing his daughter's locket and carrying his daughter's face in her features. The storm outside seemed to fade away as the magnitude of this revelation washed over him, leaving him adrift in a sea of memories and regret. The room fell into a deafening silence, broken only by the soft pops and crackles of the burning logs. David's eyes remained fixed on the golden locket hanging from Emma's neck, his whole body going rigid. The familiar shape of it, the delicate engravings he'd chosen himself so many years ago. It was like seeing a ghost. He could still remember standing in the jewelry store, spending hours picking out just the right one, wanting everything to be perfect for his little girl. His throat felt dry as sandpaper when he finally managed to speak. "Where did you get that locket?" The words came out rough, almost accusatory, his voice scratchy with emotion he couldn't quite contain. Emma's hand flew to her throat, fingers wrapping protectively around the small pendant. Her previously relaxed posture vanished as she sat up straight, tension visible in every muscle. The firelight caught the worry in her eyes as she studied David's face, catching the strange mix of recognition and pain that crossed his weathered features. "It was my mother's," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. Her fingers traced the familiar pattern on the locket's surface, a gesture she'd done countless times before for comfort. David's fingers dug into the worn leather arms of his chair. The room seemed to spin around him as memories flooded back, choosing that locket for Lily's 16th birthday, watching her face light up as she opened it, helping her clasp it around her neck. His chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped iron bands around his ribs and was slowly squeezing the air from his lungs. What was her name? The question came out harsh, demanding. He already knew the answer, but some part of him needed to hear it spoken aloud, needed the confirmation that would shatter his world. Emma hesitated, her lower lip trembling slightly. Then she lifted her chin and met his gaze directly. In that moment, he saw Lily in her face so clearly it took his breath away. The same determined set of her jaw, the same fierce look in her eyes. "Lily Coleman," she said softly, the words hanging heavy in the air between them. The name hit him like a physical blow. David staggered backward, his hand finding the rough stone of the fireplace mantel for support. His legs felt weak beneath him as the truth crashed over him in waves. Lily, his daughter, his only child, was this girl's mother. The daughter he'd driven away with his stubbornness, the one he'd never reconciled with, had given birth to this child sitting before him. The weight of all his regrets seemed to double in that instant. His vision blurred as he stared at Emma, really seeing her for the first time. The shape of her eyes, the slight tilt of her chin. How had he not recognized these pieces of Lily in her face before? The room seemed to close in around him as the weight of this revelation pressed down on his shoulders, making it hard to breathe. His past hadn't just found him. It had shown up on his doorstep in the middle of a storm, wearing his daughter's locket and carrying his daughter's eyes. Emma Brooks wasn't just some random teenager seeking shelter. She was his granddaughter, the granddaughter he'd never known existed, living proof of all the years he'd lost with his own child. David's hand trembled against the mantel as he fought to steady himself. The crackling of the fire seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy silence that followed, each pop and snap emphasizing the magnitude of this moment. Through the roaring in his ears, one thought kept repeating. Lily was gone, and she'd left behind a daughter he'd never known about. A daughter who now sat before him, a living bridge between his past mistakes and whatever uncertain future lay ahead. David's fingers dug into the wooden mantel, his knuckles turning white as he struggled to stay upright. The crackling fire seemed too loud now, each pop making him flinch like tiny explosions in the suffocating silence of the room. "You're lying," he whispered, but his voice held no conviction. Deep down, in a place he'd tried to keep locked away for years, he already knew it was true. Emma's eyes glistened with tears in the firelight, the orange glow making them look almost amber, just like her mother's. She shook her head slowly, her hand instinctively clutching the locket, the same one he'd given Lily on her 16th birthday. "No," she said softly, "I'm not." The room seemed to spin around David, the familiar walls of his sanctuary suddenly closing in on him. His chest felt tight, like someone had wrapped iron bands around it and was slowly squeezing, crushing the air from his lungs. This girl, this teenager who'd shown up on his doorstep in the middle of the night, was Lily's daughter, his granddaughter. The thought made his legs weak, threatening to buckle beneath him. He forced himself to look at her face again. Really look this time, and his heart clenched painfully in his chest. How had he not seen it before? She had Lily's eyes, that same determined set to her jaw, even the slight tilt of her head when she was trying to be brave. Even the way she held herself, slightly defensive but proud. It was all Lily, every gesture a mirror of his daughter's spirit. His mouth went dry as cotton as he formed the question he dreaded most, the one he'd been avoiding since she first mentioned Lily's name. Where is she? The words came out rough, barely audible over the crackling flames. Emma's lower lip trembled, and she swallowed hard before speaking. She looked down at her hands, now twisted together in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "She's dead," she whispered, the words falling like stones in the quiet room, heavy and final. David stumbled backward, his hand finding the back of a chair, an old wooden rocker that had been Lily's favorite as a child. He gripped it hard, trying to stay upright as the world tilted beneath his feet, threatening to send him sprawling. His daughter, his little girl. Dead. The word echoed in his mind, hollow and devastating. When? The word scraped past his throat like broken glass. 6 months ago. Emma's voice was shaky, thick with tears that she tried to blink away. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, looking so young and vulnerable that it made his heart ache even more. In that moment, she looked exactly like Lily had at that age, trying to be strong when her world was falling apart. David's fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging crescents into his palms. He couldn't breathe properly, couldn't seem to draw enough air into his lungs. 6 months. For 6 months, his daughter had been gone, and he hadn't known, hadn't been there. The weight of it crushed down on his chest like a physical thing, threatening to suffocate him. Emma spoke again, her words coming faster now, tinged with both sadness and anger that seemed to fill the space between them. She had nothing at the end. We were staying in a shelter when she got sick. She couldn't work anymore, could barely get out of bed some days. She drew in a shuddering breath, her shoulders trembling with the effort of holding back sobs. The doctors said if she'd gotten help sooner. Each word was like a knife twisting in David's gut, cutting deeper with every revelation. His daughter had been alone, sick, struggling, while he'd been here, surrounded by comfort, nursing his pride and old hurts like precious wounds he couldn't let heal. He sank into the chair, his legs no longer able to hold him. The fire blurred before his eyes as he stared into it, seeing nothing but memories of Lily as a little girl, pigtails bouncing as she ran through the yard, as a teenager full of dreams and determination, as a young woman walking away from him that last time, her back straight, despite the tears he pretended not to see. Emma's next words cut through his thoughts like a blade, sharp and merciless. "She waited for you, you know." Her voice was quiet but sharp with resentment, each word precise and cutting. "Even at the end, she kept hoping you'd come." The words hit David like physical blows, each one landing with devastating accuracy. He couldn't escape them, couldn't defend against them, because they were true. All of it was true, and the weight of that truth threatened to crush what was left of his heart. The storm outside had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind an unsettling quiet that filled the living room. The rain-washed windows reflected the dim lamplight, creating ghostly shadows that danced across the walls. David sat motionless in his worn leather chair, his mind still reeling from the revelations of the past hour. Across from him, Emma had curled herself into a tight ball on the couch, her face streaked with dried tears, her sneakers leaving small mud stains on the cushions. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the heavy seconds, its steady rhythm emphasizing the weight of their silence. David's throat felt raw, his chest aching with each breath as if someone had wrapped iron bands around it. He watched Emma, seeing hints of Lily in every movement, every gesture, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, how she bit her lower lip when nervous. The guilt was crushing, pressing down on him like a physical weight. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice coming out hoarse and strained, barely above a whisper. "Where have you been living?" Emma shrugged, turning her face away from him toward the dark window. Her fingers played with a loose thread on the blanket, pulling it longer and longer. "Shelters, sometimes in the park. Wherever I could." She spoke matter-of-factly, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather. The words hit David like physical blows, each one a testament to his failure. His granddaughter had been sleeping in parks, in shelters, homeless and alone, exposed to God knows what dangers. While he'd been here in his comfortable house, surrounded by his books and his solitude, protected from the harsh realities she'd faced every day. "You should have been there," Emma said suddenly, her voice sharp with accusation, cutting through the air like a knife. The words hung in the space between them, undeniable in their truth, heavy with years of absence and abandonment. David didn't argue. Couldn't argue. What defense could he possibly offer? She was right. He should have been there. For her. For Lily. Instead, he'd chosen pride and stubbornness, built walls so high he couldn't see over them anymore. And now his daughter was gone forever, leaving behind a child who carried the weight of his mistakes. Emma pushed herself up from the couch, her movements jerky with anger, like a puppet with tangled strings. Her voice shook as she spoke, tears threatening to spill again. "You didn't want my mom. You don't want me either, do you?" The words stung, but David couldn't deny their truth. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? That he was sorry? That he wished he could go back and change everything? The words seemed hollow, inadequate, like trying to patch a broken dam with tissue paper. He watched as Emma grabbed her wet coat from where it hung by the fire, droplets of water still falling from its hem, heading toward the door. His first instinct was to let her go. It would be easier that way. Simpler. He could go back to his quiet life, pretend this night had never happened, return to the comfortable numbness he'd cultivated for years. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the way her hands trembled as she clutched her coat, knuckles white with tension. Maybe it was how young and vulnerable she looked in that moment, a child trying to act tough while her world crumbled around her. Or maybe it was Lily's eyes looking back at him from Emma's face, challenging him to do better this time. David sighed heavily, running a hand through his gray hair, feeling every one of his years. "You can stay," he muttered, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Just for the night." Emma froze, her hand on the doorknob, shoulders tense with uncertainty. For a long moment, she didn't move, as if waiting for him to take back the offer. Then slowly, she dropped her coat back onto the hook, the sound of it falling seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet room. The fight seemed to drain out of her all at once, leaving behind only exhaustion, her shoulders sagging under an invisible weight. She made her way back to the couch, her footsteps hesitant and quiet on the hardwood floor, pulling the blanket around herself like a shield against the world. David watched as she curled up again, making herself as small as possible, as if trying to disappear into the fabric. She looked lost, vulnerable, a child trying to be an adult for far too long, carrying burdens no teenager should have to bear. For the first time in years, David felt something stir inside him, breaking through the carefully constructed walls of his isolation. A feeling he'd almost forgotten: responsibility. The weight of it settled on his shoulders, familiar and terrifying all at once, like an old friend he wasn't sure he wanted to see again. Morning light crept through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. David stood at the counter, mechanically going through the motions of making coffee. His hands shook slightly as he measured out the grounds, his mind still processing everything that had happened the night before. The sudden appearance of Emma had thrown his carefully constructed solitude into chaos. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, filling the kitchen with its familiar aroma. David leaned against the counter, his shoulders tense. He hadn't slept much. How could he? His granddaughter, a stranger until yesterday, was sleeping on his couch. Every time he'd closed his eyes, memories of Lily at that age had flooded his mind. The creak of floorboards made him turn. Emma stood in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep, wearing the same wrinkled clothes from yesterday. In the harsh morning light, she looked even younger, more fragile. But her eyes remained wary, like a stray cat ready to bolt at the slightest wrong move. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, a defensive barrier between them. "There's coffee," David muttered, gesturing awkwardly at the pot. He winced at his own gruffness, knowing he should say more but finding the words stuck in his throat. Emma's nose wrinkled slightly. "I don't drink coffee." Her voice was quiet but carried an edge of defiance. David sighed, running a hand through his gray hair. Of course she didn't. He moved to the bread box, pulling out 2 slices of wheat bread. The toaster clicked and hummed as he dropped them in, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. The morning sunshine caught dust motes dancing in the air between them. When the toast popped up, he grabbed a plate from the cabinet and placed it on the table, sliding it toward Emma without a word. She stared at it for a long moment before finally sitting down. Her movements were hesitant, calculated, as if she expected the simple offering to be yanked away at any second. The chair scraped against the floor as she pulled it out, making them both flinch. David watched as she took small, careful bites. The way she ate, like someone who hadn't known when their next meal would come, made his chest tighten with guilt. Each methodical bite was a testament to years of uncertainty he should have prevented. Why come here? The question slipped out before he could stop it. He immediately regretted the harshness in his tone. Emma's head snapped up, her defenses immediately rising. "I had nowhere else to go." Her voice was hard, challenging, but underneath it, David heard something else. Desperation. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. He didn't push further. Instead, he found himself studying her face, really looking at her for the first time. The shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, it was like looking at a ghost. She was Lily all over again, exactly as she'd been at 18. The resemblance was so strong it made his breath catch. Every familiar gesture was both a gift and a knife to his heart. Emma finished her toast in silence, each bite measured and deliberate. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a kitchen where 2 strangers, bound by blood but separated by years of absence, tried to navigate their new reality. Outside, a bird started singing, the cheerful sound a stark contrast to the heavy silence between them. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of David's office, illuminating dancing particles in the air. He hadn't spent much time in here lately. Too many memories lived in these walls. Books lined the shelves, their spines cracked and faded from years of use. Some still had Lily's old bookmarks in them, little scraps of paper he'd never had the heart to remove. A few had her notes scribbled in the margins, her neat handwriting a ghost of her presence. With trembling fingers, David pulled open the bottom desk drawer. The wood creaked in protest, and the familiar scent of old paper wafted up, mixed with the musty smell of aged wood and forgotten dreams. There, buried beneath a stack of yellowed documents, was the photo he both treasured and feared. Lily at 16, her dark hair falling in waves around her shoulders, that crooked smile he'd loved so much lighting up her face. She'd been drawing that day, her sketchbook balanced on her knee, pencil poised mid-stroke as she looked up at the camera. His chest tightened as he traced the edge of the photograph, remembering how she used to lose herself for hours in her art. He was so lost in the memory that he didn't hear the soft footsteps behind him until Emma was there, her presence filling the quiet room like a thundercloud before a storm. She went rigid when she saw what he held. David could feel the tension rolling off her in waves, could sense how her arms crossed defensively across her chest. A gesture so like Lily's it made his heart ache. Even the way she shifted her weight to one foot was painfully familiar. What was she like? The words slipped out before he could stop them, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with emotion and regret. Emma's response was sharp, cutting through the air between them like a blade of ice. "You don't get to ask that." David winced, his fingers curling around the photo's edges. The guilt sat heavy in his chest, a familiar weight he'd carried for years, growing heavier with each passing season. "She talked about you, you know," Emma continued, her words dripping with bitterness. Wondered if you'd ever come back." She paused, letting the words sink in like poison. "But you never did." David's throat felt tight, constricted with years of unspoken apologies. He couldn't argue, couldn't defend himself. There was no defense for abandoning his daughter, for letting pride and stubbornness build a wall too high to climb. Emma's voice grew harder, each word a carefully aimed arrow. "You had a daughter. She needed you, and you weren't there." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. David stared down at the photograph in his trembling hands, at Lily's young, hopeful face, at the light in her eyes that he'd failed to protect. He'd failed her. Failed her in every way a father could fail his child. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully face that truth, to feel its crushing weight. The silence in the office grew thick and heavy, broken only by the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall and Emma's quiet, angry breathing. Outside, a bird called, the sound somehow making the moment even more unbearable in its normalcy. The morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, swirling like tiny stars. David stood at the counter, mechanically stirring his coffee, though it had long since gone cold. The silence in the house felt like a physical presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing against his skin like a wool blanket in summer. Emma sat at the far end of the kitchen table, picking at a piece of toast without really eating it. Her shoulders were hunched, defensive, as if expecting a blow. Her oversized sweater made her look even smaller than she was. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each second of uncomfortable silence between them, its rhythm somehow both irritating and hypnotic. David cleared his throat. "You need anything from town?" His voice sounded rough, unused, like an old engine struggling to turn over. Emma shook her head without looking up, the toast crumbs scattered across her plate like tiny islands in a sea of white porcelain. Her fingers fidgeted with the sleeve of her sweater, pulling at a loose thread. He watched her from the corner of his eye, noting how she seemed to fold in on herself, taking up as little space as possible. It was a habit he recognized, something people learned when they'd spent too long feeling unwanted. The observation made his chest ache with a familiar guilt. The refrigerator hummed, a constant drone that only emphasized the lack of conversation. David moved to the sink, rinsing his mug with more attention than necessary, letting the warm water run over his weathered hands. The running water provided a brief respite from the crushing quiet. "Your room," he started, then corrected himself. "The spare room needs fresh sheets." His fingers tightened around the mug as he spoke. "I told you I'm not staying," Emma muttered, but there was a slight tremor in her voice that betrayed her uncertainty. Her nail scraped against the table's surface, leaving invisible marks. David nodded, more to himself than to her. "Still needs fresh sheets." He kept his tone neutral, careful not to push too hard. He opened a cabinet, pretending to organize the mugs inside, though they both knew there was no need. Through the reflection in the window, he could see Emma watching him, her expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. She looked so much like Lily had at that age, the same way of tilting her head when she was trying to figure something out, the same crease between her eyebrows. The morning stretched on, each minute feeling like an hour, heavy with unspoken words. They moved around each other like wary cats, careful to maintain their distance, creating an intricate dance of avoidance. When their paths crossed in the hallway, Emma pressed herself against the wall, making herself smaller. David pretended not to notice, but each time it happened, it felt like another weight added to his chest, another reminder of all his failures. He found himself listening to her movements throughout the house, the careful footsteps upstairs, the quiet closing of doors, the sound of running water when she used the bathroom. Each noise reminded him that his solitary existence had been disrupted, that his carefully constructed walls were being tested by this unexpected intrusion. The house seemed to creak and settle differently with another person in it. Around noon, he heard her in the living room, her feet shuffling across the carpet. He stayed in the kitchen, absently wiping down counters that were already clean, the rag moving in endless circles. The distance between them might have been measured in feet, but it felt like miles of emotional terrain neither knew how to cross. A loud crash from the living room made them both jump. David hurried in to find Emma standing over a fallen picture frame, her face pale as paper, hands trembling at her sides. "I didn't mean to," she started, her voice tight with anxiety, eyes wide with fear of consequences she'd clearly faced before. "It's fine," David cut her off perhaps too quickly. He bent to pick up the frame, careful of the broken glass that sparkled on the carpet like scattered diamonds. It was an old photo of the house, taken years ago when the paint was fresh and the garden was still maintained before time and neglect had taken their toll. Emma backed away, her shoulders tense, arms wrapped protectively around herself. "I'll pay for it." The words came out in a whisper. David shook his head, setting the broken frame on the coffee table. "Don't worry about it." He wanted to say more, to somehow bridge this vast gulf between them, but the words wouldn't come. They stuck in his throat like thorns. They stood there for a moment, the broken glass between them like a physical manifestation of their fractured connection. Then Emma turned and fled upstairs, her footsteps quick and light on the stairs like a startled deer. David remained in the living room, staring at the broken frame, at the way the splintered glass distorted the image of better days. The sound of a door closing upstairs echoed through the quiet house, and he sighed heavily, running a hand through his gray hair. The gesture felt as tired as he did. The evening shadows crept through the dimly lit hallway, stretching across the worn floorboards like dark, grasping fingers. A single lamp cast a weak, flickering glow, barely illuminating the space outside David's office. Emma wandered the house restlessly, her socked feet making soft, muffled sounds against the aged wooden floor as she struggled to find peace. As she passed David's office for the third time, something caught her eye. A drawer, slightly ajar, seemed to beckon her with an unspoken invitation. Emma hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to ensure she was alone, before stepping closer and carefully pulling the drawer open further. The drawer creaked softly, revealing dozens of yellowed envelopes neatly stacked inside, their edges worn soft with the passage of time. Emma's hands trembled as she reached out and gently picked up one of the letters. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw the name written in careful, familiar handwriting, Lily Coleman. Overcome with a sudden, overwhelming curiosity, Emma opened the first letter, the paper crackling beneath her trembling fingers. "Dear Lily," it began, the words conveying a profound sense of regret and longing. "I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to tell you how sorry I am." As Emma's vision blurred with tears, she grabbed more of the letters, frantically scanning their contents. Some were short, others pages long, but all of them were filled with remorse, explanations, and desperate pleas for forgiveness. All of them unsent, trapped in the confines of the drawer for years. Something inside Emma snapped, and the pain and anger she had been holding back rushed forward like a broken dam. Gathering the letters in her arms, she stormed toward the living room, her feet pounding against the wooden floor with each step, determined to confront the man who had kept these hidden truths from the world. David looked up from his chair, startled by Emma's sudden and impassioned entrance. His eyes widened with a mixture of dread and recognition as he saw the letters she held in her trembling hands. Emma's hands shook as she threw the letters onto the coffee table between them, scattering them like fallen leaves, some sliding to the floor. "You had all this time to reach out, and you never did?" she cried, her voice cracking with the weight of her emotions. David's face drained of color as he stared at the exposed letters, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned white. The physical evidence of his cowardice and failure lay bare before him, and he was powerless to deny it. "All these years," Emma continued, her tears now flowing freely down her flushed cheeks, "you sat here writing letters you never sent. Do you know what she went through? Do you even care?" David opened his mouth, but no words came out, his guilt and shame rendering him speechless. "She waited for you." Emma's voice dropped to a whisper thick with pain and accusation. "She was sick and alone, and she waited. And you left her with nothing." The heavy silence that followed was almost suffocating, the weight of David's failure and Emma's anguish hanging in the air like a physical presence. David reached for one of the letters with a trembling hand, but stopped short, as if the mere touch of the paper might burn him. "She needed you," Emma's voice cracked, her words a whisper laced with sorrow. "We both did." David sat there, surrounded by the physical manifestation of his cowardice, unable to defend himself or offer any meaningful explanation. For the first time, the shame he had buried beneath years of isolation rose to the surface, raw and undeniable. Emma turned away, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Without another word, she fled the room, leaving David alone with his undelivered words and unspoken apologies. The sound of her footsteps faded up the stairs, followed by the resounding slam of a door. David remained motionless in his chair, staring at the scattered letters that represented years of his failure, each one a painful reminder of the chances he never took and the love he never showed. Morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, casting warm squares of light across the worn linoleum floor. The house felt different today, still tense, but somehow lighter, as if last night's confrontation had cleared some of the heaviness from the air. Even the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams seemed to move more freely. David stood at the stove, his movements mechanical as he cracked eggs into a sizzling pan. The familiar pop and hiss of breakfast cooking filled the silence, mixing with the gentle whir of the ancient refrigerator. He hadn't made breakfast for anyone but himself in years, and his hands felt clumsy with the spatula. Twice he almost broke the yolks trying to flip them over easy, the way he used to make them for Lily. The soft padding of feet made him stiffen. Emma appeared in the doorway, freezing when she saw him at the stove. Her eyes widened slightly, taking in the scene, the plate of toast already on the counter, the eggs cooking in the pan, the two places set at the table. Her hair was still messy from sleep, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Without a word, David slid the eggs onto a plate and placed it in front of one of the settings. Emma hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her oversized sweater, pulling at a loose thread. Finally, she sat down, her movements cautious like a wary cat, the chair scraping softly against the floor. The clock on the wall ticked loudly as Emma picked at her food, taking tiny bites between long pauses. David pretended to focus on his own plate, but he watched her from the corner of his eye, noting how thin she looked in the morning light. Her collarbones jutted out beneath her sweater, and her wrists seemed impossibly delicate. "You didn't have to do this," Emma finally muttered, pushing a piece of egg around her plate with the tines of her fork. David shrugged, his fork scraping against the ceramic. "You need to eat." The words came out gruffer than he intended, but they carried an undertone of concern he couldn't quite hide. They fell back into silence, but something had shifted. The quiet wasn't as suffocating as before. It felt more like the pause between sentences than the wall it had been, filled with unspoken possibilities. Emma set her fork down, her voice barely above a whisper. "So, you wrote those letters." Her fingers traced the edge of the table, following an old scratch in the wood. "I did." David's response was gruff but not unkind, his weathered hands wrapped tightly around his coffee mug. "Why didn't you send them?" Her question hung in the air between them, heavy with years of absence. David's grip tightened on his fork, his knuckles turning white. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to be honest. "I was a coward." The admission seemed to physically pain him, his shoulders hunching slightly. Emma didn't respond, but she picked up her fork again and took another bite. David did the same. They finished their breakfast in silence, the morning sun growing stronger outside the window, turning the kitchen into a warm haven of light and shadow. It wasn't much, just eggs and toast and painful truths, but it was a start. Sometimes, David thought, the biggest changes begin with the smallest moments. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front porch as David rocked slowly in his weathered chair, the wood worn smooth from years of similar moments. The gentle creaking of wood filled the comfortable silence between them, a rhythmic soundtrack to their shared solitude. Emma sat on the worn steps, her arms resting on her knees as she gazed out at the quiet street, absently tracing patterns in the peeling paint with her finger. For the first time since she arrived, the air didn't crackle with tension. replaced instead by a fragile peace. The rumble of an approaching mail truck broke their peaceful moment, its familiar diesel engine echoing down the street. David barely glanced up as the familiar blue vehicle pulled to a stop at their mailbox, its brakes squeaking slightly. The postman, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair, climbed out and walked up their path with a stack of envelopes. "Afternoon, Mr. Coleman," he said, handing over the mail with a friendly smile. David nodded his thanks, shuffling through the usual bills and advertisements, until his fingers landed on a thick, official-looking envelope with a government seal. Something about its weight made his stomach clench, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He tore it open carefully, unfolding the crisp pages inside with trembling fingers. The words hit him like a physical blow, each sentence hammering into his chest. His hands began to shake as he read further, his throat going dry as paper. Emma, noticing his reaction, straightened up, her body tensing like a coiled spring. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tight with worry, eyes scanning his face. David had to clear his throat twice before he could speak, his mouth suddenly desert dry. It's from Child Services." He forced himself to continue reading aloud, his voice growing hoarser with each word. The letter detailed how Emma's biological father's family had suddenly emerged from the shadows of the past, filing for legal custody. Emma's face drained of color, leaving her pale as chalk. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "That's not possible." She jumped up from the steps, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. "They never wanted me before. Why now?" Her voice cracked with panic and betrayal, tears threatening to spill. "Mom tried to contact them when things got really bad, when we were living in that awful shelter. They wanted nothing to do with us." David's hands tightened on the paper, creating deep creases in the official letterhead. The protective instinct that surged through him took him by surprise, fierce and overwhelming. Just days ago, he'd wanted nothing more than for Emma to leave. Now, the thought of losing her made his chest ache with an almost physical pain. But legally, what right did he have? He was just the estranged grandfather who'd failed his own daughter, who'd let his stubborn pride keep him away until it was too late. The courts would probably laugh him out of the building if he tried to fight this. Emma paced the porch like a caged animal, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold herself together. "I won't go with them," she declared, but her voice shook with barely contained fear. "They're strangers. They abandoned us just like—" She stopped herself, but David knew what she meant. Just like he had. David carefully folded the letter and set it down beside him, his jaw set with determination. His mind was already made up, years of regret crystallizing into resolve. He might have failed Lily, but he wouldn't fail Emma. Not this time. "We'll fight this," he said firmly, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. Emma stopped pacing and stared at him, hope and doubt warring in her expression like storm clouds in summer. "We'll fight this," he repeated, and he meant every word with every fiber of his being. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. David stood at the counter, mechanically stirring his coffee, his mind racing with thoughts of the letter that lay unopened on the table. He hadn't slept much last night, spending hours tossing and turning, thinking about what they could do to fight this. The weight of responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Emma sat at the kitchen table, pushing scrambled eggs around her plate without eating. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't slept either, and her usually neat ponytail was messy, strands falling around her face. The letter from Child Services sat between them like an unwelcome guest, its official letterhead seeming to mock their newfound peace. The crisp white envelope a stark contrast against the scratched wooden table. "We should talk about this," David said finally, his voice rough from lack of sleep. He settled into the chair across from Emma, wrapping his weathered hands around his coffee mug, seeking comfort in its familiar warmth. Emma's fork clattered against her plate with more force than necessary. "There's nothing to talk about. I won't go with them." Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear beneath her defiant words, her knuckles white as she gripped the fork. "They're legally family," David said carefully, hating the way Emma flinched at his words, as if they'd physically struck her. But that doesn't mean we can't fight it. I've been thinking, I know a lawyer in town, Margaret Jenkins. She might be able to help us understand our options. He tried to keep his voice steady, reassuring. Emma looked up, hope flickering briefly in her eyes before doubt clouded them again, like sun disappearing behind storm clouds. What options? You're not even my legal guardian. I just showed up on your doorstep a few days ago. She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve, a nervous habit he'd noticed. David leaned forward, surprising himself with the intensity of his words. You're my granddaughter, Lily's daughter. That means something even if I haven't earned the right to claim it yet. His coffee sat forgotten, growing cold. Emma's fingers found the locket at her throat, clutching it like a lifeline, the same way Lily used to do when she was nervous. Mom used to say the Brooks family never wanted anything to do with me. Why now? Why after all these years? Her voice cracked on the last word. David shook his head, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. I don't know, but we're going to find out. His jaw clenched at the thought of these strangers trying to claim Emma now, after years of silence. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence that followed, each second echoing like a thunderclap. Outside, a bird chirped cheerfully, oblivious to the tension within the house. A gentle breeze rustled the curtains as Emma pushed her plate away untouched. What if... She started, then stopped, her voice small and uncertain, almost childlike. What if they win? What if they make me leave? David's hand tightened around his coffee mug until his knuckles turned white. The thought of Emma being taken away, just when they were starting to build something, just when he was getting a chance to make up for his past mistakes, made his chest ache with a pain that was almost physical. I won't let that happen, he said firmly, meaning every word. I know I've got no right to make promises given my track record, but I'm not running away this time. We'll fight this together. He met her gaze steadily, willing her to believe him. Emma studied his face, searching for any sign of uncertainty. Whatever she saw there made her shoulders relax slightly, some of the tension easing from her posture. Okay, she whispered. Together. David stood up, his chair scraping against the floor as his decision crystallized. I'll call Margaret this morning. Get her advice on what we're dealing with. He paused, then added softly, and Emma. Try to eat something, we've got a long fight ahead of us. Emma picked up her fork again, taking a small bite of the now cold eggs. The simple act of eating seemed to ground her, give her something normal to focus on in the midst of their upturned world. A bit of color returned to her cheeks as she took another bite. David watched her, his heart heavy with a mixture of worry and determination. He'd failed Lily, let her slip away when she needed him most. The memory of that failure still haunted him, but it also strengthened his resolve. He wouldn't make the same mistake with Emma. Not this time. Not ever again. Some battles were worth fighting, and this was one of them. The law office felt smaller than David remembered from his last visit years ago. Dusty law books lined the walls, their gold-lettered spines faded with age, and the afternoon sun streaming through Venetian blinds created stripes of light across Robert Langston's cluttered desk. The old ceiling fan whirred quietly overhead, its blades casting gentle shadows as they spun, doing little to dispel the stuffiness of the room. David sat stiffly in one of the worn leather chairs, the material creaking beneath him, while Emma perched nervously in the other. She kept fidgeting with her locket, a habit David had noticed whenever she felt anxious, her fingers running over its smooth surface again and again. Robert adjusted his reading glasses, carefully reviewing the custody petition spread out before him, the papers rustling softly in the quiet room. This isn't going to be easy, Robert finally said, looking up from the papers, his expression grim. David's stomach tightened. What do you mean? Robert set the documents down with a gentle tap and folded his hands on the desk. You have no legal claim to Emma. So what, they just get to take me? Emma's voice cracked slightly, fear evident in every word. Not necessarily. Robert leaned back in his chair, the old wood groaning softly. But we need proof that staying with David is in your best interest. David watched as Robert explained the harsh reality of their situation, each word feeling like a weight on his shoulders. Family court heavily favored blood relatives, which meant Marcus Reynolds, Emma's father's half-brother, had a strong initial advantage. "That man never cared about me," Emma spat out, her hands balling into fists in her lap. "He didn't even come to Mom's funeral. Not once did he try to help us when we needed it." Robert nodded sympathetically, removing his glasses to clean them with his tie. "That's exactly what we need to prove. We need to show the court that Marcus Reynolds isn't seeking custody out of genuine concern for your welfare." David listened intently as Robert outlined their options, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his chair. They needed evidence, anything that would show Marcus was an unfit guardian, or that Lily had specifically wanted to keep Emma away from that side of the family. "What kind of evidence?" David asked, his voice rough with worry, leaning forward in his seat. "Letters, emails, a will, anything from Lily that clearly states her wishes regarding Emma's care," Robert explained, spreading his hands. "The more documentation we have, the stronger our case becomes. Without it, we're fighting an uphill battle." Emma slumped in her chair, looking defeated, her shoulders drooping. "Mom didn't leave much behind. We moved around a lot. Sometimes we left places so quickly we barely had time to pack." Robert leaned forward, his expression serious, his tie brushing against the scattered papers. "We need something concrete. A letter, a will, anything from Lily that proves her wishes." David took a deep breath, his mind racing back to the letters in his office drawer, the ones he hadn't been able to bring himself to read in years. "I might have something." Emma's head snapped up, and for the first time since they'd entered the office, a glimmer of hope appeared in her eyes, brightening her whole face. David's office felt like a time capsule, filled with the ghosts of memories he'd tried to forget. The wooden desk creaked under the weight of scattered papers, old photographs, and yellowed envelopes. A single desk lamp cast a warm glow across the chaos, throwing long shadows on the walls. Dust motes danced in the beam of light, stirred by their movements through decades of accumulated memories. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor nearby, watching as David methodically sorted through drawer after drawer. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as if each piece of paper might crumble at his touch. The ticking of the old wall clock seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy silence. Every now and then, his breath would catch at something he found, though he'd quickly compose himself and continue searching. Emma's fingers absently played with her locket, a nervous habit David had noticed over the past few days. The golden pendant caught the lamplight, a constant reminder of Lily. Finally, her soft voice broke the silence, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "Did you love her?" David's hands froze over a stack of letters. The question hit him like a physical blow, making his chest tighten painfully. He looked up slowly, meeting Emma's eyes. His throat felt tight, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "More than anything." Emma shifted, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. "Then why did you leave?" David exhaled heavily, running a weathered hand through his gray hair. The truth felt bitter on his tongue, like medicine he'd avoided taking for far too long. "Because I was stubborn, and I thought she didn't need me." The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He returned to his searching, trying to hide how his hands trembled. Then he saw it, an envelope he didn't recognize, sealed and marked with Lily's distinctive handwriting. His heart skipped a beat as he carefully opened it, his fingers shaking so badly he nearly tore the paper. The paper inside was covered in Lily's familiar scrawl. As he read, his vision blurred. Words jumped out at him: pain, abandonment, longing, but most of all, hope. Hope that he would try harder. Hope that he would come back. Each word felt like a knife twisting in his gut. "This is it," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with unshed tears. Emma moved closer, leaning over to read the letter. Her shoulder brushed against his arm as her eyes scanned the words her mother had written so long ago. The warmth of her presence was both comforting and painful. "She wanted you to come back," she said softly, her own voice wavering slightly. David felt tears burning behind his eyes. All these years he'd told himself Lily was better off without him, that she didn't want him around. But here was proof of how wrong he'd been, written in his daughter's own hand. The weight of his failure pressed down on his chest until he could barely breathe. Each breath felt like it might shatter him completely. With trembling fingers, he carefully placed the letter in a manila folder, treating it like the precious artifact it was. He looked at Emma, seeing Lily's eyes looking back at him, full of the same determination he remembered in her mother. This could help. Emma nodded, her jaw set with determination, a flash of hope lighting up her features. Then let's use it. The morning sun painted long shadows across David's front porch as he sipped his coffee, trying to calm his nerves. The warm mug felt steady in his weathered hands, a small comfort against the chill in the air. Birds chirped in the distance, their songs a stark contrast to the tension building in his chest. He watched a cardinal flit between the branches of the old maple tree, wishing he could feel as free. The crunch of tires on gravel made him look up. A sleek black car, too expensive for these parts, crawled up his driveway like an unwelcome intruder. The Mercedes' polished surface reflected the morning light like a mirror. David set his mug down with a soft thud, his muscles tensing as he watched a man step out. Marcus Reynolds looked exactly like the kind of person who'd try to buy his way into anything. Designer suit, polished shoes, and a smile that never reached his eyes. His silk tie probably cost more than David earned in a week. He strode up the porch steps like he owned them, radiating an arrogance that made David's stomach turn. "You must be David," Marcus said, his voice smooth as oil. The morning breeze ruffled his perfectly styled hair. David didn't move from his chair, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "What do you want?" Marcus shrugged, adjusting his expensive cufflinks. A diamond glinted on his finger. "Just making sure you know what's coming." "I know exactly what's coming." David's voice was low, steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. A chuckle escaped Marcus's lips, cold and calculated. "Then you know you don't stand a chance." The screen door creaked behind them, its rusty hinges protesting. Emma stepped out, freezing mid-step when she saw Marcus. Her face drained of color, but her eyes hardened instantly, her hands curling into tight fists at her sides. Marcus turned to her, his smile sickeningly sweet. "Long time, kid." "Not long enough." Emma's words came out like ice, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. Marcus smoothed his jacket, turning back to David. His expensive cologne hung heavy in the morning air. "This is just business, old man. Don't take it personally." David rose from his chair, drawing himself up to his full height. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath his feet. "It's personal to her," he said, his voice steel. "And that makes it personal to me. We'll see." Marcus's smirk lingered as he turned and walked back to his car, each step deliberate and measured. His shoes clicked against the worn wooden steps. David watched the black car disappear down the driveway, kicking up dust in its wake, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. Emma stood beside him, rigid and silent. The morning birds had stopped singing, leaving behind an eerie quiet. "I hate him," she whispered, her voice barely audible, shaking with years of buried pain. David turned to look at her, seeing the fear behind her anger, the trembling in her shoulders. "You're not going anywhere." The words came out firm, a promise set in stone. He'd die before he let Marcus take her away. The morning air bit at David's skin as he watched the dust settle on his gravel driveway. His hands balled into tight fists so hard his knuckles had turned white. Marcus's visit had left a sour taste in his mouth and a fire in his belly that threatened to consume him whole. Beside him, Emma stood rigid, her arms crossed so tightly against her chest it looked painful. Her eyes were fixed on the settling dust cloud, as if daring Marcus's expensive black car to return. David let out a long breath, trying to release some of the anger coursing through him like poison. "That man isn't taking you anywhere. Not if I have anything to say about it." Emma let out a bitter laugh that held no trace of humor. "Yeah? And what if the court decides he should? What then?" David turned to face her, his voice firm and steady as steel. "Then we fight harder. We'll do whatever it takes." "You say that now," Emma shot back, her words sharp as glass, her green eyes flashing with hurt. "But where were you when my mom needed you? When we both needed you?" The question hit David like a physical blow to the gut. He'd heard it before, but it still cut deep, reopening wounds that had never really healed, wounds that still bled fresh whenever he thought of Lily. Emma shook her head and stepped off the worn wooden porch. Her boots crunched against the carpet of fallen leaves as she walked toward the woods behind the house, autumn colors swirling around her feet. David called after her, but she kept walking, her shoulders hunched against the morning chill and something heavier than just cold. He watched as she found an old fallen oak trunk and sat down, pulling her knees up to her chest like a shield against the world. She looked so small out there, so alone, just like Lily used to when she was upset, in those teenage years before everything fell apart. David hesitated for a moment, then followed the path Emma had taken. The fallen leaves crackled under his heavy feet as he approached. Without saying a word, he lowered himself onto the log beside her, leaving enough space between them to respect her boundaries while still showing he was there. "You don't get it," Emma whispered, her voice barely louder than the rustling leaves above them in the cool morning breeze. "I don't belong anywhere. I never have." David rubbed his rough, calloused hands together, feeling the morning cold seep into his bones. "You belong here," he said simply, with quiet conviction. "With me. This is your home now, if you want it to be." Emma turned to look at him then, really look at him. Her eyes searched his weathered face, looking for any hint of uncertainty or insincerity. But for the first time since she'd arrived on his doorstep, she saw something different in his expression, something solid and unwavering like bedrock. She exhaled slowly and dropped her gaze to the ground, watching a red maple leaf spiral down from above. "We'll see," she murmured, but her voice held a touch less bitterness than before. David nodded. It wasn't much, but it wasn't nothing either. Sometimes the smallest steps forward were the most important ones, and he'd take whatever progress he could get. The desk lamp cast a warm yellow glow across David's office, making the dust motes dance in the air like tiny stars. He should have been sleeping, but rest wouldn't come. Not tonight. Not after everything that had happened. His fingers traced the edge of his desk drawer before pulling it open, revealing a small wooden box he hadn't touched in years, its presence both a comfort and an accusation. The box was nothing special, just old pine with a simple brass latch that had grown dull with time. But what it contained made David's hands tremble as he lifted it out. He placed it carefully on the desk, wiping away years of dust with his sleeve, revealing the grain of wood underneath. Inside, memories waited. The first thing he saw was a stack of wrinkled papers, Lily's childhood drawings, crude crayon sketches of a house, a family, a garden, each one telling its own story of happier times. His throat tightened as he remembered her presenting each one with such pride, her pigtails bouncing with excitement. "Look what I made, Daddy," she would say, beaming, her gap-toothed smile lighting up the room. Beneath the drawings lay Mr. Snuggles, the worn teddy bear Lily had carried everywhere until she was 8. One eye was missing, and the fur was matted with age, its once soft brown surface now gray and rough. But David could still see her clutching it to her chest as she slept, thumb in mouth, peaceful and innocent. At the bottom of the box, partially hidden under the bear, was an envelope, its edges soft and worn from handling. David's heart seemed to skip a beat as he recognized Lily's teenage handwriting, the careful loops and swirls so like her mother's. With trembling fingers, he pulled out the letter, unfolding it carefully as if it might crumble to dust, the paper thin and delicate between his fingers. "Dear Dad," he read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper in the quiet room. "I don't know if I'll ever send this. I don't even know if you'd read it if I did. But I need to write it anyway." David's voice caught as he continued, each word a knife to his heart. "I hate you for leaving. I hate that you chose your pride over me. But what I hate most is that even now, after everything, I still wish you'd come back." He had to stop, pressing his palm against his eyes, fighting back the burning sensation. "I should have come back," he whispered to the empty room, his words heavy with regret. I should have been there. A floorboard creaked, and David looked up to find Emma standing in the doorway, her silhouette outlined by the hallway light. Her eyes were fixed on the box, curiosity written across her face mixed with something else. Recognition, perhaps. What's that? David stared at the letter in his hands, considering. Then, slowly, deliberately, he held it out to her. Emma stepped forward, taking it carefully, as if she understood its importance. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper as she read, punctuated by their quiet breathing. David watched her face, trying to read her expression, but it remained carefully blank, a mask she'd learned to wear too young. When she finished, she looked up at him, her voice soft but firm. She wanted you. The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. David lowered his head, staring at his desk, unable to meet her eyes. The guilt felt like a weight pressing down on his shoulders, threatening to crush him. And I wasn't there. The silence stretched between them, filled with all the things they'd never said, all the hurt, all the regret, all the lost chances that hung in the air like invisible threads connecting them. Finally, Emma folded the letter with the same care David had shown it, smoothing each crease with gentle fingers. She placed it gently back in the box, her movements deliberate and respectful. "Good night, David," she said quietly and turned to leave, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. David watched her go, those two simple words echoing in his mind. No anger, no accusations, just, "Good night, David." And somehow, that meant everything, carrying a weight of understanding that left him both heartbroken and hopeful. Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the mess of papers scattered across the worn oak table. David stared at the documents until the words blurred together. Bank statements, character references, and legal forms he barely understood. The coffee in his mug had gone cold, forgotten in the rush to organize everything before Robert arrived. A few drops had stained one of the forms, making him wince. Emma sat across from him, absently twirling her mother's locket between her fingers. The familiar gesture made David's heart ache. It was exactly what Lily used to do when she was nervous. The silver pendant caught the light, reminding him of countless moments just like this one years ago. The doorbell rang, its sharp chime cutting through the tense silence, and moments later Robert Langston walked in, his weathered briefcase tucked under his arm. His tie was slightly crooked, and he looked tired but determined as he pulled up a chair, the legs scraping against the linoleum floor. "We need a game plan," Robert said, laying his briefcase on the table with a dull thud. David nodded, picking up Lily's letter from the pile, his fingers trembling slightly. "We have this. Does that help?" Robert took the letter, adjusting his reading glasses as he scanned the contents. His expression remained neutral, but David could see the slight furrow in his brow and the way his mouth tightened at the corners. "It's something, but it won't be enough on its own." Emma's arms crossed tightly over her chest, her knuckles white with tension. "So what else do we need?" Robert leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, spreading a few papers apart. "Marcus is going to try to prove that you're better off with him. We need to show the court the opposite." He began listing the strategies Marcus might use: his financial stability, the blood relation, promises of private schools, and better opportunities. Each point felt like a physical blow, and with each one, David felt his stomach sink lower, his coffee threatening to come back up. "I can provide for her, too," David insisted, though his voice wavered slightly. The morning paper's job listings peeked out from beneath the legal documents, circled positions still waiting for his calls. Emma slammed her palm on the table, making both men jump. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot. "What about what I want? Doesn't that count?" Robert sighed, removing his glasses to rub his tired eyes. Dark circles beneath them betrayed many sleepless nights. "It does. But courts look at what they think is best for you, not always what you want." David's fists clenched under the table, his nails digging into his palms. "Then we make them see she belongs here." The determination in his voice surprised even him. Emma glanced at him, a flicker of hope crossing her face, her fingers momentarily stilling on the locket. Robert stood, gathering his papers back into his briefcase with practiced efficiency. "We start in 2 days." 2 days? Emma whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for her locket again, the chain making a soft clicking sound against her fingernails. David moved to her side, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The gesture felt awkward, but necessary. Through the thin fabric of her shirt, he could feel her trembling slightly. "We'll be ready." The courthouse loomed before them, its stone facade cold and imposing against the morning sky. David adjusted his tie for the 10th time, his fingers trembling slightly. His reflection in the polished brass door handles showed a man he barely recognized, cleaned up, proper, fighting for something that mattered. Beside him, Emma stood straight-backed but pale, her mother's locket clutched tightly in her hand, the metal warm from her nervous grip. Inside, their footsteps echoed off the marble floors, each step bringing them closer to a moment that could change everything. The courthouse smelled of furniture polish and anxiety, with undertones of old paper and wood. Other people hurried past, clutching briefcases and documents, but to David, they were just blurs of motion, their voices a distant hum. Marcus Reynolds was already there, seated on a bench with his expensive suit and practiced smile. His Italian leather shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his gold watch caught the sun streaming through the high windows. He looked more like he was attending a business meeting than fighting for custody of his niece. When he saw them, his smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes, which remained calculating and cold. Emma's grip on David's hand tightened, her small fingers digging into his palm. He squeezed back, trying to pour all his strength into that simple gesture, wishing he could shield her from what was coming. The courtroom doors opened with a heavy creak. They filed in, taking their places on the worn wooden benches. Robert Langston arranged his papers carefully, his movements precise and measured, while Marcus's lawyer, a sharp-faced woman in designer clothes with perfectly manicured nails, did the same, her red-soled shoes tapping impatiently against the floor. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice bouncing off the high ceiling. Judge Whitmore entered, her black robes sweeping behind her as she took her seat at the bench. Her silver hair was pulled back severely, and her face gave nothing away as she surveyed the room through wire-rimmed glasses. Marcus's lawyer spoke first, her voice smooth and practiced like honey over glass. "Your Honor, my client can provide Emma Brooks with everything she needs: financial security, educational opportunities, a stable home environment. Mr. Reynolds is her blood relative and has the means to give her the future she deserves. His 3-story home in Westbrook has plenty of space, and the private school he selected is one of the finest in the state." Robert stood next, his voice steady and warm with conviction. "Your Honor, family isn't measured in dollar signs or bank accounts. It's measured in love, in presence, in being there when someone needs you. David Coleman has provided Emma with something she's never had: a real home, emotional support, and genuine care. He's helped her grades improve, supported her art, and given her the stability she desperately needs." Judge Whitmore's eyes settled on Emma, sharp but not unkind. "Miss Brooks, where do you want to be?" Emma stood, her voice surprisingly steady despite her shaking hands. The morning light from the tall windows caught the silver of her mother's locket. "With David, Your Honor. He's my grandfather, and he's the only real family I have left. He's teaching me about carpentry, and he reads to me every night, just like my mom used to." Marcus's lawyer shot to her feet, her silk blouse rustling. "Objection, Your Honor. The girl is clearly making an emotional decision rather than a rational one. She's been through trauma, losing her mother, and isn't in a position to make this choice objectively. A child needs more than bedtime stories and woodworking lessons." Judge Whitmore frowned, her fingers laced together as she considered, the silence in the courtroom thick and heavy. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke, each word measured. "I'm postponing my final ruling until I have more time to review all the evidence. In the meantime, Mr. Reynolds will be granted temporary visitation rights, to be supervised and scheduled through the court." Marcus's smirk was barely concealed as he gathered his things and strode from the courtroom, his victory already assumed. His shoes clicked against the floor, each step confident and sure. Emma watched him go, her face pale, fingers worrying at the hem of her dress. "What if they take me?" she whispered, her voice small and scared, like the child she truly was beneath her brave facade. And David shook his head firmly, pulling her close to his side. They won't. But deep inside, he felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him, heavy as an anvil on his chest. The decision was out of their hands now, floating somewhere between hope and fear in the sterile air of the courthouse. David stood by the window, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched for any sign of Marcus's car. The morning sun cast long shadows across the living room, where Emma sat rigidly on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself like armor. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," David said softly, not turning from the window. "Yes, I do," Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The judge ordered it. A sleek black car pulled into the driveway, its polished surface gleaming. Emma's face went pale, and her hands began to tremble. David crossed the room and placed a firm hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring. "If you're uncomfortable, call me, I'll come get you," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. Emma nodded, her jaw clenched tight. "I will." The doorbell rang and Emma flinched. David opened the door to find Marcus standing there, wearing an expensive suit and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ready to go, Emma?" Marcus's voice was smooth as silk, but something about it made David's skin crawl. David's eyes narrowed as he watched Emma gather her things. He wanted to say something, anything, but he knew this wasn't his choice to make. Emma had to see Marcus for who he really was on her own. At the upscale restaurant, Marcus ordered without even asking what Emma wanted. The white tablecloths and crystal glasses felt alien to her as she picked at her food, barely listening while Marcus droned on about his business successes and his beach house in the Hamptons. "You could have all of this, you know," Marcus said, gesturing at their surroundings. "Private school, shopping trips, vacations, anything you want." But he never once asked about her art. Never questioned how she was doing in school or what she liked to do for fun. He didn't even mention her mother. When Marcus finally dropped her off, he barely slowed the car to a stop before Emma was out the door. She hurried inside, where David waited in the living room, concern etched on his face. "How did it go?" he asked quietly. Emma turned to him, her eyes clear and certain. "They don't care about me. They just want to look good on paper." David nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Sometimes the richest offers came from the poorest hearts. The courthouse hallway buzzed with nervous energy as David and Emma walked through the metal detectors. Robert Langston met them at the entrance, his briefcase clutched tightly in his hand. Emma's fingers wrapped around the locket at her throat, a habit she'd developed when anxious. Marcus Reynolds and his attorney, Richard Evans, were already there, huddled near the courtroom doors. Marcus shot them a smug smile that made David's stomach turn. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore called the proceedings to order. The sound of his gavel echoed through the room, making Emma flinch beside David. Richard Evans rose first, his expensive suit perfectly pressed. "Your Honor, while sentiment is touching, we must consider what's best for Emma's future. Mr. Coleman at his age simply cannot provide the stability and opportunities that Mr. Reynolds can offer." David's fists clenched under the table as Evans continued, laying out financial records and bank statements. "Mr. Reynolds owns multiple properties, has substantial savings, and can ensure Emma receives the finest education." Robert Langston stood next, his voice steady. "Your Honor, family isn't measured in dollar signs." He held up Lily's letter. "This letter shows the devastating impact of choosing wealth over emotional bonds. Emma needs stability, not financial, but emotional. She needs someone who truly cares about her well-being." When Emma was called to speak, she stood on shaky legs. "I know what it's like to live without money," she said, her voice trembling but growing stronger. "But I also know what it's like to live without love. David, he's trying. He's really trying. That matters more than any fancy house. Marcus interrupted, standing abruptly. She's just a scared child. She doesn't understand what's best for her future. Something in David snapped. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. She knows more than you ever will. The judge's gavel cracked through the air. Mr. Coleman, control yourself or I'll hold you in contempt. David sank back into his chair, his heart pounding. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses, looking stern. I'm scheduling a final hearing 1 week from today. This will be your last chance to present any additional evidence. I suggest you all use this time wisely. Outside the courthouse, David's legs gave out and he collapsed onto a stone bench. He buried his face in his hands, the weight of everything crushing down on him. The cool air did nothing to calm his racing heart. Emma sat beside him, her small hand coming to rest on his shoulder. You're really fighting for me, she whispered, wonder in her voice. David lifted his head, meeting her gaze with tears in his eyes. I should have fought sooner. The evening sun cast long shadows through David's office window as he sat at his desk, surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with memories. His fingers trembled slightly as he lifted the lid off another dusty container, revealing stacks of old letters and photographs. Emma sat cross-legged on the worn carpet, methodically sorting through papers spread around her. The only sound was the gentle rustling of paper and occasional sighs as they searched for anything that might help their case. Look at this, Emma said softly, holding up a yellowed envelope. David took it carefully, noting Lily's distinctive handwriting. It was addressed to Sarah Mitchell, Lily's childhood friend. As David read the letter aloud, his voice grew thick with emotion. I miss Dad so much, Lily had written. I know we both said things we regret, but I hope someday Emma will find him. She deserves to know her grandfather. This could change everything, David whispered, carefully placing the letter in their evidence folder. Emma dug deeper into another box, gasping when she pulled out a photograph. The edges were worn, but the image was clear. David holding a baby Emma, Lily beaming beside them. We were together once, Emma said quietly, running her finger along the edge of the photo. David turned to a filing cabinet, pulling out a stack of old bank statements. His hands shook slightly as he spread them across the desk. Here, look at these. The papers showed years of money transfers to Lily's account, even after their falling out. You were still trying to help her, Emma realized, studying the statements. I couldn't just... David's voice cracked. I couldn't leave her with nothing. Emma grabbed a fresh piece of paper and began writing, her pen moving quickly across the page. What's that? David asked. A letter to the judge, she replied, not looking up. He needs to understand why I need to stay here. With you. David watched her write, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and determination. When she finished, she added it to their growing folder of evidence. Emma stood and placed her hand over David's as he stared at the completed folder. We've got this, she said firmly. David nodded, a small but determined smile forming on his lips. Yes, he agreed quietly. Emma looked up at him, her eyes shining with hope. Let's win this. David rose from his chair, gripping the folder like a lifeline. Yes, let's... The morning sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the packed courtroom. David's hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie, watching as people filed into the wooden benches. Emma sat beside him, her shoulders tense, fingers fidgeting with her mother's locket. Judge Whitmore entered, her black robe sweeping behind her. All rise, the bailiff called out. The rustling of bodies standing filled the air. This is your final opportunity to present evidence, Judge Whitmore stated firmly. Mr. Evans, you may begin. Richard Evans rose smoothly, his expensive suit gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Your Honor, Mr. Coleman abandoned his own daughter. How can we trust him with his granddaughter? His words cut through the air like daggers. He has limited income, an aging home, and a history of walking away when things get difficult. David's jaw clenched, but Robert squeezed his arm gently, reminding him to stay calm. When Robert stood to counter, his voice carried warmth and conviction. He presented the newly discovered letters, photographs, and bank statements. Your Honor, these records show Mr. Coleman never truly abandoned his family. He sent money regularly, even when communication had broken down. Emma's testimony came next. She walked to the stand, her steps steady despite her trembling hands. David is the only person who's really tried to understand me, she said, her voice breaking slightly. Marcus never cared about me before. He just wants to win. Richard Evans pounced, his questions sharp and calculated. Isn't it true you're just a troubled teenager making emotional decisions? Emma's chin lifted, tears streaming down her face. Family isn't just blood. It's who shows up. Her words echoed through the silent courtroom. Marcus took the stand next, his performance polished and practiced. I only want what's best for Emma, he claimed, though his eyes never quite met hers. The clerk read Emma's letter to the judge aloud. The courtroom fell silent as her words filled the space. David is the first person who made me feel like I belonged somewhere. Please don't take that away. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, her questions direct and probing. Mr. Coleman, how do you plan to provide for Emma's future? I may not be wealthy, David answered honestly, but I can give her what she needs most, a home, love, and someone who will never walk away again. Robert's closing argument resonated through the courtroom. Your Honor, wealth can buy many things, but it can't buy belonging. It can't buy love. Emma has found both with David. We'll take a brief recess before announcing my decision, Judge Whitmore declared, rising from her bench. Outside the courtroom, David and Emma stood close together. The morning sun had given way to clouds, casting everything in a gray light. Emma's grip on David's hand tightened. What if we lose? David looked down at her, his voice steady despite his fear. Then we'll keep fighting. Together. The heavy courthouse doors closed behind them as they waited for the judge's return. The courtroom held its breath. David's collar felt too tight as he sat rigidly in his chair, Emma's grip on his hand turning his fingers numb. Across the aisle, Marcus lounged in his seat with an air of entitlement, while his lawyer whispered something that made him smirk. The heavy wooden doors creaked open. Judge Whitmore entered, her expression carefully neutral as she took her place at the bench. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise!" Everyone stood. David's legs felt weak. Emma's shoulders trembled beside him. Be seated, Judge Whitmore commanded. She adjusted her papers, the sound deafening in the silent room. This has been a difficult case with compelling arguments from both parties. David's stomach dropped. He'd heard that tone before. It usually preceded bad news. Emma's fingers dug deeper into his palm. But then Judge Whitmore continued, her voice clear and firm. However, after reviewing all evidence, it is in the best interest of Miss Emma Brooks to remain under the legal guardianship of David Coleman. A small gasp escaped Emma's lips. David sat frozen, the words not quite registering. Across the aisle, Marcus's smug expression crumpled. We won? Emma whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she clutched David's arm. We really won? Judge Whitmore continued outlining her ruling, explaining how Marcus's petition was denied and confirming David's full guardianship. The words washed over David like a healing balm. A loud bang made everyone jump. Marcus had slammed his hands on the table, face red with anger. His lawyer grabbed his arm, trying to calm him, but Marcus shrugged him off. Order! Judge Whitmore warned sharply. Mr. Reynolds, my decision is final. David turned to shake Robert's hand, his vision blurring with grateful tears. Emma stood tall, facing Marcus directly. You never wanted me, she said, her voice steady and clear. You just wanted control. Marcus stormed out without a word, the door slamming behind him. Outside the courthouse, the fresh air felt like freedom. Emma turned to David, her eyes still glistening. Thank you, she whispered. David wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. You never have to thank me for loving you. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches across the worn wooden floor. 2 days had passed since the court ruling, and the house felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a heavy storm cloud had finally lifted. Emma descended the stairs slowly, her bare feet making soft padding sounds against the steps. The aroma of coffee and scrambled eggs drifted up to meet her, and her stomach growled in response. She reached the bottom and paused in the kitchen doorway, taking in the scene before her. David stood at the stove, his back to her, spatula in hand as he tended to the eggs. There was something so ordinary about it, so domestic. The kitchen radio played quietly in the background, an old country song she didn't recognize. It felt surreal, this moment of normalcy after everything they'd been through. She watched as David moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, pulling plates from the cupboard and pouring a second cup of coffee. He glanced up, catching her hovering in the doorway. "Are you going to stand there all day or are you going to eat?" he asked, his gruff voice holding a hint of warmth she was starting to recognize. A small smile tugged at Emma's lips as she moved to sit at the table. David placed a plate of scrambled eggs in front of her, along with some buttered toast. She took a careful bite, the eggs perfectly seasoned and fluffy. "Not bad," she muttered, trying to hide how much she actually enjoyed it. David's lips twitched into a smirk as he sat down across from her with his own plate. High praise. Emma's eyes wandered around the kitchen, taking in details she hadn't noticed before. The old copper kettle on the stove, the collection of well-worn cookbooks on the shelf, the morning light catching the crystal wind chimes hanging outside the window. Everything about it felt right. "It's nice here," she said softly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. David took a long sip of his coffee before responding. "It's home, if you want it to be." Emma nodded, her throat suddenly tight with emotion. "Yeah, I think I do." David exhaled slowly, and she could see some of the tension leave his shoulders. They ate in comfortable silence for a few moments, the only sounds the clink of forks against plates and the quiet music from the radio. Finally, Emma looked up at David, a mischievous glint in her eye. "Do I have to call you Grandpa?" David chuckled, a real, genuine laugh that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Only if you want to." Emma grinned, stabbing another bite of eggs with her fork. "We'll see." The gray clouds hung low over the small cemetery, releasing a gentle drizzle that misted their faces. David and Emma stood side by side before Lily's headstone, the marble surface glistening with tiny droplets. The grass beneath their feet was damp, and a cool breeze rustled through the nearby trees. David knelt slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and placed a bouquet of fresh lilies at the base of the headstone. The bright white flowers stood out against the dark stone, a splash of life among the somber surroundings. Emma watched, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, less from the cold and more from the weight of the moment. "She was stubborn, you know," Emma said softly, breaking the silence. David's lips curved into a faint smile, his eyes never leaving the headstone. "She got that from me." Emma looked at him, a hint of warmth in her voice. "And me?" The rain continued its gentle pattern around them as David spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Lily. I'm sorry for all the years we lost, for not being there when you needed me." His voice cracked slightly. "I can't change the past, but I promise to do better now." Emma stepped forward, reaching out to touch the cool surface of the headstone. Her fingers traced the engraved letters of her mother's name. "I wish you could see this, Mom," she whispered, tears mixing with the raindrops on her cheeks. David placed a steady hand on Emma's shoulder. "She does." They stood there in silence, letting the quiet of the cemetery envelop them. The drizzle began to ease, and a ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a soft glow over the headstone. Neither of them felt the need to rush away from this moment of connection. Finally, Emma took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. "Let's go home," she said, the word home feeling natural on her tongue now. As they walked back toward the car, Emma slipped her hand into David's. He smiled, squeezing it gently, and together they made their way through the cemetery, leaving behind the weight of the past but carrying forward the love that had brought them together. Sunlight streamed through the windows of David's house, casting warm patches across the wooden floors. The house felt different now, lived in, shared. Emma's red jacket hung carelessly on the coat rack, her worn sneakers tossed haphazardly by the door. Little signs of her presence had begun to accumulate, transforming the once lonely space into something new. David stood at the bottom of the stairs, coffee mug in hand. "Emma," he called up, "come down here." A muffled groan came from upstairs. "It's too early for whatever this is." David rolled his eyes, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Just come on." Heavy footsteps dragged across the upstairs floor, followed by the creak of stairs. Emma appeared, her hair disheveled from sleep, still wearing her oversized pajamas. She rubbed her eyes, squinting at him suspiciously. "This better be good," she muttered, stifling a yawn. David gestured toward a closed door down the hall. "Open it." Emma frowned, suddenly more awake. "What's going on?" "Would you just open it?" David's voice was gruff but gentle. Emma walked to the door, hesitating for just a moment before turning the handle. As the door swung open, her mouth fell open in surprise. The room before her had been completely transformed. Soft blue paint covered the walls, the exact shade she'd mentioned liking weeks ago. A wooden bookshelf lined the far wall, its shelves already filled with both old and new books. In the center of the room sat a bed with a handmade quilted blanket, the pattern intricate and welcoming. Emma stood frozen in the doorway, unable to form words. Her eyes traveled around the room, taking in every detail. The small desk by the window, the cork board waiting for pictures, even the string lights draped across one wall. David cleared his throat awkwardly. "I figured you should have a space that's really yours." Emma blinked rapidly, fighting back unexpected tears. "You did this?" David shrugged, trying to seem casual despite the emotion in his voice. It was time. Emma stepped into the room, her fingers trailing along the spines of the books on the shelf. She recognized some from her mother's descriptions, books Lily had loved at her age. New ones sat alongside them, waiting to be discovered. She turned back to David, her voice thick with emotion. "It's perfect." David nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face. "Good. You deserve it." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front yard as David methodically trimmed the bushes lining the porch. The rhythmic snip of the shears matched the peaceful turning of pages from inside, where Emma sat curled up in the living room with a book. These quiet moments had become their new normal, comfortable, safe. Through the open window, David could hear Emma humming softly to herself. The sound made him smile. She'd started doing that recently, little unconscious signs that she felt at home. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the tranquility. David looked up, frowning at the unexpected sound. Emma's face appeared at the window, her expression immediately tense. "It's him." David turned to see a sleek black car pulling into his driveway. His jaw tightened as Marcus Reynolds stepped out, looking perfectly polished in an expensive suit. The man carried himself with an air of entitlement that set David's teeth on edge. Marcus walked up to the porch, hands tucked casually in his pockets. "We need to talk." "I don't think we do," David replied, his voice hard as steel. Emma moved to stand behind David, and though her presence was strong, he could feel the tension radiating from her. "Come now," Marcus said smoothly. "I'm letting all this go." "Just wanted to check in on Emma." His tone dripped with false sincerity. "See how she's doing in her new situation?" "I don't need you to check on me," Emma cut in, her voice steady despite her clenched fists. "I don't need you for anything." A flicker of irritation crossed Marcus's face before he forced it into a patronizing smile. "You'll change your mind." David stepped forward, positioning himself more firmly between Marcus and Emma. "No, she won't." Marcus studied David for a long moment, his eyes cold despite his smirk. Enjoy this while it lasts." With that, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving a chill in the warm afternoon air. They watched in silence as Marcus's car disappeared down the driveway. David's fists remained clenched at his sides, his shoulders tight with tension. Emma looked up at him, her voice quiet but certain. "He's not coming back. He just wanted to rattle us." David nodded, though the encounter had left him unsettled. They stood together on the porch, the peaceful afternoon now feeling somehow different. The Christmas tree lights cast a warm glow across the living room, their soft twinkle reflecting off the window panes. David stood back, watching as Emma carefully hung ornaments on the branches. He couldn't remember the last time he'd put up a tree, probably that final Christmas before Sarah passed away. After that, the holidays had felt too empty, too painful. But now, watching Emma reach up to place a silver star on a high branch, something long dormant stirred in his chest. The house felt alive again, filled with the scent of pine and cinnamon. Emma paused, holding a small ceramic ornament. Her fingers traced the painted letters spelling out "Lily" in delicate script. David's breath caught in his throat as he recognized it, one he'd made with Lily at a pottery shop when she was just 10. With gentle reverence, Emma placed it on a prominent branch. She glanced at David, seeking approval. He nodded, fighting back the thickness in his throat. "I found something for you," Emma said suddenly, reaching behind the couch. She pulled out a carefully wrapped package, looking almost shy as she handed it to him. David unwrapped it slowly, his eyes widening as he revealed an old vinyl record, Charlie Parker's Bird with Strings. He hadn't seen this album in years. "How did you—" he started. "I noticed you humming jazz sometimes," Emma explained, "and I saw some old records in your office. The store owner said this was a good one." David smiled, touched by her thoughtfulness. "It's perfect." He reached under the tree and pulled out a wrapped package of his own. "This is for you." Emma opened it to find a leather-bound sketchbook and a set of professional art supplies. Her eyes lit up as she ran her fingers over the smooth paper. "I've seen you drawing," David said softly. "You're good, just like your mother was." They settled into the worn armchairs by the fireplace, mugs of hot cocoa warming their hands. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional pop of burning wood. "I haven't had a real Christmas in a long time," Emma murmured, staring into the flames. David nodded, understanding in his voice. "Me neither." Emma shifted, leaning her head against David's shoulder. "Merry Christmas, David." He smiled, feeling more at peace than he had in years. "Merry Christmas, kiddo." The crisp February morning painted the sky in soft shades of pink and orange. David sat on the wooden porch steps, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The backyard stretched out before him, dormant grass and bare trees waiting for spring's touch. Emma's footsteps creaked on the porch boards behind him. She appeared at his side, holding 2 fresh mugs of coffee. Without a word, she handed him one and settled beside him on the step. The steam from their cups danced in the cool morning air. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun peek over the distant tree line. The quiet felt natural now, unlike the tense silences that had filled the house when Emma first arrived. Finally, Emma's voice broke through the morning stillness. "You really loved her, didn't you?" David's hands tightened around his mug. He stared straight ahead, but his mind wandered to memories of Lily as a little girl, her smile bright and trusting. "More than anything." Emma took a deep breath, her next words careful and measured. "I think she would have forgiven you." David's throat tightened, making it hard to swallow. "I hope so," he managed, his voice rough with emotion. They sat quietly for a moment before Emma spoke again. "I've been thinking about college." David turned to look at her, surprised but trying not to show it. He nodded encouragingly. "Whatever you need, I'll help." Emma let out a small laugh. "You sure? College is expensive." A smirk tugged at David's lips. "So is raising a kid," and I somehow ended up doing that. Emma playfully nudged his shoulder with hers. You're not terrible at it, you know. David's eyebrows shot up in mock surprise. Are you saying I'm actually a decent guardian? Don't get ahead of yourself, Emma grinned, taking another sip of her coffee. The morning light had grown stronger now, warming their faces. Emma's eyes fixed on the brightening sky. I never thought I'd get this. David looked at her, studying her profile that reminded him so much of Lily. What's that? A small, content smile spread across her face. A second chance. David nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Neither did I. The spring afternoon wrapped the world in golden light. Fresh flowers dotted the front yard, their colors bright against the green grass. The old maple tree's leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, casting dancing shadows across the porch. Emma's car pulled into the driveway, kicking up a small cloud of dust. David sat in his usual chair, watching as she grabbed her bag from the back seat. Her hair was longer now, pulled back in a messy ponytail. A year of college had changed her in subtle ways. She dropped her bag on the porch with a thud. David grinned up at her. You're back already? Thought you'd want to stay out late? Emma rolled her eyes, but her smile was warm. I like it here. David gestured to the empty chair beside him. Then sit down. She settled into the chair, stretching her legs out in front of her. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Emma watched it for a moment before speaking. It's funny. What is? David raised an eyebrow. She turned to look at him, her expression soft. I begged you to let me stay that first night. David chuckled, remembering the storm-soaked girl who'd shown up at his door. And now? Now you're stuck with me, Emma smirked. They sat in comfortable silence before Emma spoke again. I'm different now, you know? A year ago, I was just lost. We both were, David admitted quietly. Emma nodded. Mom would have loved this, seeing us together. David reached behind his chair and pulled out a small wrapped package. Speaking of your mom, Emma took it carefully, unwrapping it to reveal a framed photograph. Her breath caught as she looked at it. David, much younger, holding a baby Emma while Lily beamed at the camera. Her fingers traced the glass gently. She'd be happy we found each other, Emma whispered, tears gathering in her eyes despite her smile. She held the frame close to her chest. David nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. Yeah, he said softly. She would be. The house behind them hummed with life, so different from the hollow shell it had been just a year ago. Together, they watched the sun sink lower in the sky, painting everything in warm, golden light. If you enjoyed the story of David, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.